Countries all around the world are watching Russia's war in Ukraine to pick up on lessons learned, and China's no different. I've talked in a past video about how China is keeping an eye on the Ukrainian deployment of HIMARS and what Russia is doing or failing to do to counter that threat, because Taiwan is supposed to be getting those in the near future. And recently, a Chinese defense magazine published an article focused in on Russia's logistical challenges. Now, the RAND Corporation picked this apart, translated it, and provided their analysis that we'll be able to run through here. They say in this Chinese analysis, 3 different stages of the war are identified as pertaining to logistics. In chronological order, they have the pre-war buildup and initial attack, a second phase that essentially corresponds to the period after the abandonment of the Northern Front, which is pretty early in the war, and the current situation as it has evolved in 2023. So the logistics picture, not always the most sexy part of war, not always the most interesting, but it does play a major role in, especially the war in Ukraine right now, how the war did not shake out how Russia intended in the very early days, right? Logistics is a major reason the war sits the way it does today, and that it's even still being fought. They say before the operation began, the war in Ukraine, troops and supplies were amassed under the guise of a war game. I don't know if you remember that. There were satellite imagery coming out from the United States and NATO countries saying, hey, Putin, we see what you're doing. You're loading up troops on the Ukrainian border. Don't do it. Don't go into Ukraine. And there was an idea that simply showing that we were watching their movement and watching them kind of consolidate assets at the border might show that they don't have the element of surprise and they're not going to carry out the attack. Of course, they went forward with it anyways. One of the things that Russia was saying at the time was they were there for war games, so much so that they were even telling some of their troops. Remember, they thought they were going off to training exercises, and a week later, all of a sudden, they're in Ukraine facing, lethal fire from Ukrainian anti-tank teams all across the country. So that whole idea of kind of hiding the reason that troops are on the border under the guise of a war game, China picked up on it. I don't know if they necessarily viewed that as being successful or not, simply noting that it existed. They continue on saying Russia abandoned its northern front due to a poorly performing offensive caused by logistical issues, which, if you remember back to that time period, there were a couple different reasons pointed to as to why Russia left that northern attack approach into Kyiv, mostly from Belarus. Russia presented it as a goodwill gesture to facilitate negotiations, but one of the major points that people were picking up on at the time, and now is even more clear, is that Russia didn't have the resources to maintain that foothold into Ukraine. The essentially 3 different axes of attack was too much for the Russian logistical system at that time. But real quick, a thank you to the sponsor of today's video. I know in the military, there were a bunch of guys, as they were exiting the service, they wanted to pursue a career related to firearms. And if that's you, Sonoran Desert Institute is 100% worth checking out. SDI has programs that cover armor courses, gunsmithing, ballistics, woodworking and finishes, shooting sports management, and more. Plus, tools and materials are shipped direct to your door for hands-on practice. SDI is DEAC recognized and be a great way to kickstart a career you're actually interested in. Visit sdi.edu or call 480-999-4767 to learn more. The article continues saying, before the war, high-level Russian army leadership generally underestimated the enemy and believed the operation would quickly achieve victory. Because of the brushing aside of Ukraine's actual military strength, insufficient supplies of equipment and ammunition were prepared. This is something that's kind of interesting to think about, because you can't, Russia wasn't going to put 100% of their capabilities on the border with Ukraine. They were never, and they still haven't, committed 100% of their force to the fight. Right? Even if it's the majority of their ground combat power, they still have forces scattered all around the world in a lot of places, and definitely all across the country. How is China going to approach that? How much of their force, looking at these lessons learned from Russia, how much of their force and how much of their supplies and ammunition are they going to stockpile with immediate access to support a potential invasion of Taiwan? Which leads into what the military actually has available at their disposal. The Chinese article continues saying, in the beginning, the Russian army carried out large-scale strikes using precision-guided munitions. By the second phase, the Russian army's precision-guided munitions were in short supply. This led to the use of more and more unguided artillery shells, rockets, and tactical missiles from the ground forces. The Russian military's long-range strike capability was severely constrained. Understood. I think we've known that for quite a while. This isn't news. What's interesting here is China putting out information, an ally of Russia putting out information kind of recognizing this fact that the precision munition stockpiles that Russia had were not enough to fight a long war, especially after, Ukraine did not fall in the first few days, weeks, or even months. It's something that China is likely looking at, figuring out, do they increase production of their dumb munitions, or do they prioritize fewer precision munitions? What I'm seeing in this article is that the ammunition concern is not just here in the United States, right? One of the major arguments as it relates to what we're seeing in the war in Ukraine is the vast quantities of ammunition being used, the vast quantities of dumb munition, unguided rounds, and how Europe and the United States are having to stand up new factories just to pump out 155 millimeter artillery rounds, right? China is looking at that as well and wondering if they are going to be able to keep up with production. It's not, this isn't, the lack of munitions and the volume that this war is going through. It's not as though the United States and NATO are the only ones looking at this saying, wow, that was unexpected. Countries all around the world are looking at their stockpiles, wondering if they have set aside what would actually be needed to fight a modern war. They continue here saying that supply lines have been harassed by the Ukrainian army, causing logistical support to not operate normally. The Ukrainian army used small-scale targeted strikes to destroy the bridges and rail lines used to resupply the frontline combat troops. I think it was interesting they brought this up because I wonder if the perception is that early munitions and early strikes would be used against, combat power, tanks, artillery pieces, command posts right at the front, essentially reducing the adversary's ability to fight. And it's understandable why you would want to do that. If you break it down to the very simplest level, if you're in a firefight, in a gunfight with adversarial forces, and you have one loitering munition, are you going to use that loitering munition to knock out the tank that's shooting at you? Or are you going to use that to strike their supply lines, which means that over the next few days or weeks, they don't have the ammunition to continue the assault, right? So in the very short term, you understand why the tank would want to be hit. And I wonder if looking at the Russian-Ukrainian war, China expected most of those early strikes to be carried out against combat power, whereas Ukraine was doing that, but also able to push some of those strikes into the rear and affect Russian logistics. That might not be something that China was necessarily preparing for in a fight with Taiwan. On that note, they say these deep attacks have included strikes in border regions outside of Ukraine, including Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk, and targeted oil refineries with the intent to cut off the supply of oil to Russia's military. PLA, People's Liberation Army, it's the Chinese military, strategists may attempt early on to target Taiwanese weapon systems that could reach into mainland China and potentially disrupt key logistical nodes and support infrastructure. Again, you have to imagine that was at least a little bit on their mind, that some of these long-range systems would not necessarily be used exclusively to stop a landing or an airborne assault or whatever it might be, but could be used to strike further inland with China. Maybe it's just driving that lesson home. Maybe what they're seeing play out in Russia just confirms some of those beliefs. A couple interesting notes here as they wrap up. They say, while the article is heavy on analysis of Russian problems, it is light on predictions as to whether and how Russia might adapt to the difficulties identified. There appears to be little optimism that Russia can fully overcome the logistical challenges it faces. It should also be noted that the article does not cover how corruption might have degraded Russia's logistical support system in advance of its war against Ukraine. So a couple thoughts there. It is normal for a healthy military to look at what other nations and other militaries have done wrong. We can learn from others' mistakes. So the fact that this article designed for consumption inside of China is looking at problems in the Russian military is to be expected. The fact that they're not shining light on how to resolve it, I would say, is also somewhat expected, right? If China has the solution to these problems, that's quickly turning into a national security topic and not something they're going to blast out there into the open. And of course, is interesting. I don't know exactly how the levels of corruption would compare between China and Russia, but leaving that part out entirely. Again, these are allied nations. They have friendly ties. Maybe they're trying to throw them a bone there, right? But in wrapping up, they say it's a safe bet that China would be better prepared from the outset of a Taiwan scenario than Russia was at the start of its invasion of Ukraine, not least because PLA planners are closely watching and learning from the Ukraine war. So to go back to the beginning of the video, it's just everybody. There's something happening in the war in Ukraine for every country, every military, every group around the world, whether they're trying to learn advanced drone techniques for off-the-shelf UAVs, trying to figure out how loitering munitions can be stopped, or the use of long-range precision munitions, air defense, or as China is looking at through this article here, the logistical challenges in modern war. But that's all I got for now. I will link this article in the description below, as well as a link to the national security sit reps I put out on Substack. That's 7 to 10 of the top national security stories each week, along with a few podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.